I think the biggest takeaway from the original portrait project is what we've been referring to as the bottleneck issue. We know that since the 1980s and certainly in the 90s in particular, there's been a tremendous growth of Asian Americans going to law school and entering the profession, a really dramatic rise, almost five-fold rise over that time period. But what Portrait Project 1.0, the original project, identified was that Asian Americans weren't reaching the highest rungs of the profession, weren't at the top of equity partner, the bench, prosecutors, even GCs at one point, the legal academy. And so we've referred to this, Justice Liu and I have referred to this as the bottleneck issue, that there is a tremendous inflow of Asian Americans in the legal profession for the last couple of decades, but we don't see them reaching the highest rungs of the profession in terms of leadership.
Good afternoon, Ajay.
Good afternoon, Charles. How are you?
Great, great. Well, thank you for joining me and joining AABA this afternoon. Wanted to see if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Of course. Thank you. So my name is Ajay Mehrotra. I'm the executive director and a research professor at the American Bar Foundation, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit research organization focused on the study of law and legal institutions and legal processes. I'm also a law professor at Northwestern University and an affiliate member of the history department at Northwestern. So I wear multiple hats, and I'm very excited to be one of the co-principal investigators of Portrait Project 2.0, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Wonderful. And if you wouldn't mind, for those who are not familiar with Portrait Project 1.0 or the original version, what was the genesis of that project, and can you give us some background?
Of course. So Portrait Project 1.0, or the original project, really began as a project spearheaded by Justice Goodwin Liu of the California Supreme Court, who worked with NAPABA and Yale Law School in really trying to learn more about how Asian Americans are situated in the legal profession. I think that was the primary goal. I had just become executive director about 4 or 5 years ago of the ABF when that project was moving along, and Justice Liu had reached out to me for some access to data that we have. We've been doing a longitudinal study of the legal profession for almost 2 decades called After the JD, and there's a wealth of data there that's publicly available, but we just ask requests for the kind of information. And Goodwin reached out to us and used a lot of that data and gathered his own data. He had an excellent team of Yale Law students working with him on that original project. And then it was published just a couple of years ago, at which point Goodwin notified me about it and asked if I would help with the dissemination. And so we were honored at the ABF to do a press release and do a number of other things to get the word out about Portrait Project 1.0. Goodwin and I co-authored an op-ed for Law 360, where we shared some of the findings of both AJD and Portrait Project as it relates to Asian Americans in the legal profession in particular. And then from there, Goodwin and I started a discussion about follow-up research. And so he came to me and said, well, would the ABF be interested in being the sort of organizational hub of Portrait Project 2.0? And I was, of course, delighted. What we do here at the ABF is study law writ large, and one of our hallmark areas is the profession. I mentioned After the JD, but we do all kinds of work, especially on diversity and inclusion in the profession. And so it was quite an honor when Justice Liu asked the ABF to partner with him and others in launching Portrait Project 2.0, and that was about 2 years ago or so.
Wonderful. And so the original Portrait Project, can you give a sense of why that particular research project was necessary?
Sure. So as I understand it, Justice Liu first came to this because of his own interests in legal education. As you know, and I'm sure everyone knows, he was a law professor before he was on the Supreme Court. And one of his areas was about legal education and diversity in legal education. And so I think he's long been an advocate of the importance of diversity and inclusion in legal education. I think he was surprised at the lack of any scholarship or research on Asian Americans in particular. There have been a number of studies here and there, but there really wasn't any kind of comprehensive, systematic look. Even basic demographic data was available, but it hadn't really been collected and analyzed. And so I think he really thought this was a very important area to study. And so with some funding support from the Yale Law School, he and, as I said, a few Yale Law students were able to really embark on this initial study that I think really was a landmark pioneering study of how Asian Americans are situated in the legal profession, throughout the profession, everything from enrollment into law schools to clerkships to professional mobility from firms to GCs to representation in the legal academy and nonprofits and the bench and prosecutors. It really was a very broad-based study that I think was very useful to all of us who are interested in diversity and inclusion in the profession, and really started, I think, a very important conversation about Asian Americans in the legal profession.
Would you mind sharing some of the major findings of the first portrait project and how that led you to the second set of questions?
Sure. I think the biggest takeaway from the original portrait project is what we've been referring to as the bottleneck issue. We know that since the 1980s, and certainly in the 90s in particular, there's been a tremendous growth of Asian Americans going to law school and entering the profession, a really dramatic rise, almost five-fold rise over that time period. But what Portrait Project 1.0, the original project, identified was that Asian Americans weren't reaching the highest rungs of the profession, weren't at the top of equity partner, the bench, prosecutors, even GCs at one point, the legal academy. And so we've referred to this, Justice Liu and I have referred to this as the bottleneck issue, that there is a tremendous inflow of Asian Americans in the legal profession for the last couple of decades, but we don't see them reaching the highest rungs of the profession in terms of leadership. That was, I think, the one big takeaway. And then within specific sectors, we identified a number of other ones. I'll just mention a couple of quick ones for you, and we can talk more. One is that there's been a recent enrollment decline of Asian Americans into law school. And so we, I think, all know that since the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, law school enrollment has plummeted. But it's really striking to see that Asian Americans going to law school has been even a larger drop than the general population. And so that's an important finding. It leads to an open question that hopefully Portrait Project 2.0 will look further into. The other thing that I think that's most important from the findings of the first project is the mobility issue, the fact that Asian Americans may not be reaching the highest rungs of partnership in private law firms, but we do see a lot of them entering GC's office. And so one of the open questions that we have for the second project is, what does that tell us about the push or perhaps pull factors in the legal profession as it applies to Asian Americans? Are they not reaching partnership because of ceilings or implicit bias or some other rationales, or is that they're finding better opportunities in other areas of the profession? So that's an open empirical question that we hope to address along with several others in this new phase of the project.
Mm-hmm. Was the original Portrait Project able to identify some conclusions as to what might be the barriers to advancement or the cause of the bottleneck?
Yeah, so I think we've identified some. I mean, I think what we're hoping to do is find a little more detail. This is what Portrait Project 2.0 will be focusing on, is a little bit more about the causation. That's always much more challenging than just the demographic snapshots that we've taken. We do know that mentorship is crucial, and we know this not only from the Portrait Project, but from other parts of the literature on the legal profession, a lot of the work we've done here at the ABF and other organizations, about how critical it is to have a mentor or multiple mentors who are not just mentors but often sponsors. This is actually well documented, I think, in the literature on diversity and inclusion in the profession writ large, that the more mentors you have, the more sponsors, especially those who are in powerful positions, the greater chances you have of landing clerkships, for that matter. So we see it very early on in the pipeline to prestige and power in the profession. We certainly see it at law firms as well, and I think we will find, we haven't identified it yet, that it also occurs in other parts of the sector, other sectors, of the profession as well, in terms of who's getting on the bench, who's actually getting leadership roles in the academy and nonprofits, right? It's the network effect. The importance of social capital is something we hope to delve into further in the second portrait project.
In 2017, our AABA's then president, Miriam Kim, approached the board to discuss a proposal to celebrate 100 APA GCs in the Bay Area. And then as part of it, raise money for the Portrait Project 2.0. I think some of our listeners might be interested in knowing how our Bar Association came to work with you on 2.0.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, Charles, because we are forever grateful to AABA Bay Area for essentially providing the anchor gift, the lead investment in Portrait Project 2.0. I was lucky enough to actually be at the reception that you referenced that Miriam in her presidency was hosting. I believe John Coe at Varian, I believe Varian was the institution that hosted that reception that was honoring all the great work that has occurred in AABA Bay Area in terms of the number of GCs. And it was there that Goodwin and I made a very brief presentation about Portrait Project 1.0 and the thought. Frankly, back then it was just a glimmer of an idea about doing a follow-up. We were talking about it, but we really weren't seriously investigating it until, frankly, Miriam and the rest of the leadership at that time, soon towards the conclusion of the reception, I believe, suggested something about perhaps donating the net proceeds from that reception to the project. And we were surprised and elated and thrilled by that opportunity. And so I want to thank all your listeners who are AABA Bay Area members for essentially giving us the anchor gift, the lead investment on a project that's now getting off the ground, and that's also led to donations from other Asian American bar associations. So soon after the AABA gift, I think word spread in the Bay Area, and AABA Silicon Valley also made a contribution to us. And with those two anchor gifts, and well, we got additional support from Yale Law School, which was part of the first project, and then I, as a Northwestern faculty member, went to my dean at Northwestern, who also made a serious contribution. And since then, I've done some sort of isolated fundraising in New York and Chicago, in which we've gotten other pledges and contributions. I've got to give shout outs to Latham and Watkins and Davis Polk and Arnold and Porter. Folks at those law firms have been very supportive and actually have made multiple year pledges. And none of this fundraising, frankly, Charles, would have been possible without the AABA Bay Area initial gift. Your organization and everyone in it and your leadership, and I want to again thank Miriam in particular for during her presidency for getting this all started. That's been the anchor gift. That's been the lead investment that has helped us get this project off the ground.
Wonderful, and we're very glad to help. And APABA Silicon Valley was a partner with us on that activity, and we definitely wish you the best. As you move forward, your research is initially focused on three questions. Would you mind going through those and why those are important and what you hope to learn?
Sure. I think there may be 3 or 4 questions I think that we've identified, but we actually are going to make this a little more manageable. In the first phase, we're going to focus on 2. So let me talk about those 2 first, and then I'll talk about the other 2 that we're looking forward to tackling a little bit later in the process. So phase 1, as we're calling it, of Portrait Project 2.0, we'll be looking at enrollment trends and judicial clerkships. And so as I mentioned earlier, we've already identified from the first project that the decline in the general decline in law school enrollment has actually had a larger impact on Asian Americans than any other minority group. And so we're seeing since 2009 roughly, and there's some new data that support this that have just come out in the last year or 2 post Portrait Project 1.0 publication, that shows a precipitous decline in Asian Americans entering the legal profession. And so our first research project is one to quantify that a little further. And we have some general data, but I think we need to learn more. We believe there's a gender component to this, that more Asian American men than women are declining the opportunity to go to law school. So I think we need to learn more about, is it that they're not applying or they're not enrolling? I think there's some noise in the data right now, but we want to delve into that further. So our first research question really is about enrollment trends as it affects Asian Americans as well as other minority groups. We're seeing a decline among African Americans. We've actually seen an increase among Latinx students. So there's an interesting dynamic there that we hope to learn more about. The second question in this first phase will be about judicial clerkships. And as you can imagine, this is a topic close to Justice Liu's heart. As a judge and as a former Supreme Court clerk, we pointed out, or Portrait Project 1.0 pointed out this really interesting, stubborn discrepancy that exists between not just Asian Americans, but other underrepresented minority groups who are entering top law schools at higher numbers over the last couple of decades, but not securing clerkships. And we know clerkships can be gatekeepers or launching pads to prominent careers. And so our second research question is going to delve into why are there so few minority clerks at federal appeals court level. So we've tried to make it a more manageable study by limiting it to federal appeals court. And we've already started gathering some data. We have a couple of research assistants. And again, with the wonderful assistance we received from AABA Bay Area, we've just hired a full-time research social scientist who was really, we're very excited about that. That took a little longer than we had hoped. We, I think, have identified a terrific young, recently minted Stanford SJD student who will be helping us with that. And so those are the first two questions that we're going to attack, Charles. The other two that we hope to get to after the first phase is mobility within the profession. So we're seeing a lot of people leaving law firms for GCs. We want to quantify what's going on there with more recent data, and then figure out why. Is it a push factor or is it a pull factor? And then finally, we don't want to ignore the other sectors of the profession. So nonprofits, the legal academy, government jobs. What's going on in terms of Asian Americans? How are they situated in that sector of the profession? So those are the four general research questions we hope to attack over, as you can imagine, over multiple years of research.
Wonderful. And have you and Justice Liu and the full-time researcher that you've hired, have you formulated any hypotheses related to those four questions?
Yeah, so we're focusing, I'm glad you phrased it that way, because we are approaching this as a social science research project. And so after identifying the research questions, the next step, of course, is what are the hypotheses or tentative theses. And so we're about to present, in fact, a full proposal to the American Bar Foundation Internal Research Committee. So we have a very rigorous review process at the ABF, and Justice Liu and myself and our research assistant, Shi-Chin Chun, is going to help us with that. And one of our hypotheses for the enrollment question is just rational maximization. So we know that the legal profession writ large since 2009 has had some erosion in earnings. We know at the top end things look okay, but across the board of the profession, earnings have not kept up with other professions, for example. So one of the, I think, hypotheses we need to test is, are Asian Americans going into other professions at a greater rate simply to maximize revenue, and is this a rational choice for them? So that's really one of the hypotheses. The other thing we've learned is that there are a number of new studies out about enrollment. One of them suggests that many people who go to law school do so because they have what's known as public-spirited motivation, so they want to enter government or politics or something in the public sector. And we know from data from the American Association of Law Schools that has just done a study on this, and other organizations, that Asian Americans, generally Asian American college students, identify that as a lesser of a reason to go to law school. And so if that's the case, that might be part of the explanation why fewer are going to law school. So those are two of the hypotheses. We also want to look at cultural backgrounds, and then what the economists would call endowment effects. And what are the background assumptions Asian Americans are bringing to their choices about occupation? And how does that shape their decision? So there's a number of hypotheses we hope to test. Similarly, a number of hypotheses for the clerkship study that I can go into if that's of interest. But you can imagine we want to understand what students are doing when it comes to clerkship. We want to understand what law schools are doing in terms of mentorship. And then we'd like to understand what judges are doing in terms of selection. What criteria are they using to select their clerks? So there's a number of hypotheses or inflection points in that process as well.
Well, out of Portrait Project 1.0, I and other bar association leaders have acted on some of the potential deficiencies identified by the research, and have focused on mid-career leadership training, mid-career mentorship programs to help bridge that gap. And one thing that I would encourage ABF and the researchers to consider is what can, not just sort of accounting for high attrition rates, but also developing a set of recommendations that leaders in the bar can act on.
Yes, that's a very good point. We certainly hope that our research will shed light on that perhaps we'll find, I think initially what we want to do is diagnose the problem carefully to make sure we know what the inflection or pressure points are. So you mentioned, Charles, just now, mid-career. And I think that hypothesis is accurate. We want to test that a little further to find out what exactly is mid-career. What is the sweet spot when people are making different occupational decisions? And then we do hope to, we've already started doing some data collection through focus groups. So at the last NAPABA meeting, which was in Chicago back in the fall, we held a number of focus groups with a large number of Asian American lawyers in different stages of their career and different sectors of the profession to get a better sense of what their thought process was. We haven't exactly had a chance to analyze that data yet, but we certainly would like to, at the end of the day, once we've diagnosed the problems, perhaps come up with some best practices. What can leaders of the bar like yourself and others, what can organizations, what can law firms who want to retain some of their best talent, or corporations who want to recruit some of the best talent, what can they be doing better to address those issues? So we certainly hoped at the end of the process, once we've diagnosed it a little bit better, to have some normative recommendations.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for doing this work, and for AABA Bay Area, APABA Silicon Valley, NAPABA, and other bar organizations that might want to assist you as you perform the research. What's the best way for us to help and partner with you?
Well, that's terrific. As I said, you've already helped a tremendous amount already. We do envision this as being a multi-year project, so at some point, I think additional fundraising, quite frankly, will be necessary. That's more my job than Justice Liu, given the judicial ethics rules, so I will be doing some road shows later in the process. Right now, I think we've got sufficient funding for the next couple of years, but we really do see this as a multi-year project now that we're breaking it up into more discrete questions, so I will be calling on bar leaders when I make the rounds and seeing if we can't raise additional funding. But I think even more important than the financial support is really helping us disseminate this. So we already have some sense from the first project about the challenges, frankly, facing the Asian American legal community. And I think getting the word out, we've noticed that whenever we even just do presentation, there's a kind of consciousness raising that goes on that we need to do more of. And the best way to do that is to have organizations like AABA Bay Area disseminate this. We plan to make this more systematic, so once this project is up and running soon, I know our ABF communications team is eager to have, we're hoping for semi-annual newsletters about the progress of the research in the project that we'll be sending out to all of our supporters. Having you and others circulate that for us will be very helpful. And then collecting the data. We'll need to do more surveys and focus groups. And obviously, we have to be a little careful that we don't just use AABA organizations. As the scientists would say, a selection bias that might occur there. We want to try to get a broader swath of Asian Americans in the profession, but it's certainly that network that's going to help us do that. So I think those are the three things that we're really counting on for further support. Some additional financial support, help disseminating the research, and then helping us collect more data would be the three things that we could use additional assistance with.
All right, wonderful. Well, Ajay, thank you so much for the work you do. And I know you have 2 teenage boys at home and a full-time professor, also lead the American Bar Foundation. I don't know how you possibly do.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor to be part of this project. As I mentioned earlier, the ABF has long history and tradition of doing work on the legal profession and diversity in the profession. So it's my great honor to be working with Justice Liu and others on this project. So thank you.